So, good evening, everyone. You're all very welcome. This is the second talk in our Tipperary People and Places lecture series for 25-26. This evening, we're joined by Joanne Hughes, who's very quick to tell us that she's a Drogheda native.
Drogheda girl.
But she's been living in Cashel for over 25 years. Joanne is an archaeologist working with AMS, and she's the Environmental Impact Assessment Team Lead, if you don't mind. Now, there you go. Joanne's talk this evening is entitled Hidden in Plain Sight, 20th Century Cashel, County Tipperary. So we're in for a treat, I think, this evening. And thank you very much, Joanne. We'll have time for questions afterwards. Okay, thank you.
Thanks a million, Stephanie. And good evening, everyone. And thanks very much for coming out this evening to listen to this presentation. And I see a lot of Cashel faces in the audience, so I hope that you're going to find out something new this evening. I hope it's not going to be just more of the same, and for everyone else, I hope you'll find it worthwhile and interesting listening and viewing as well. And just in terms of the background for this presentation, it really has its roots in the IPMAG, which is the Irish Post-Medieval Archaeology Group conference that was held in Birr in 2023, and at that conference I met Colleen O'Driscoll, archaeologist from Kilkenny, and we got into a conversation about Renaissance era buildings in Kilkenny, and obviously Kilkenny has a wealth of them, and the question was asked, so do you have them in Cashel? I thought to myself, we should have plenty of buildings, but outside of the religious houses and the religious foundations, I really only knew of a handful of buildings in the town of that era. So I set myself a bit of a challenge to see what could I find and to see what, if anything, of those potential buildings is actually surviving within the urban fabric of the 21st century Cashel town. And I became, I think it's safe to say, a little bit obsessed with this period, and in particular the mid and later part of the 17th century. And I suppose the question, why the 17th century? As you all know, and I'm not going to go through any of the historical events because you're more familiar with them than I am, I'd say. It was a particularly eventful period, not just in Cashel, but in Ireland. And we do actually have quite a few sources which document disparate bits and pieces of information about the town from that time. But I don't really know of any one particular source that has really pulled together all of the strands of information for Cashel at that time, particularly the lesser known source material, which is invaluable. On top of all of that, I suppose I like a good challenge. So I said to myself, right, let's have a go at it. Let's see what we can do in terms of tying it together, and in particular for mapping the information that we have. So I started out on that challenge in 2023, and last year here in Thurles at the 2024 IPMAG conference, I presented the results of what I had found, and I presented my GIS map as well. So I'm going to show you quite a lot of that again now this evening, but also some stuff that has turned up or that I've learned about in the interim as well. So I hope you enjoy what I've been obsessed with for the last couple of years. I suppose in terms of key source material that I used, one of the most important sources was John Davis White's Cashel of the Kings. It's an absolutely amazing resource to have for the town. And I know Des Mernan there had produced a series of articles in the Tip Journal there over the last few years about John Davis White and his work. But luckily for me, I had access to the reprint of Cashel of the Kings from the British Library, and it was absolutely invaluable to me in setting out on the work on this project. But for those of you who mightn't be terribly familiar with John Davis White, very briefly, he was born in Kilkenny in 1820 and moved to Cashel in about 1831. He had a number of very important roles in the town. So he was the diocesan registrar. He was the commissioner for oaths and secretary of the infirmary. He served on the town commission, and he was a member of the board of guardians. But most importantly for me was his role as the diocesan librarian, which meant that he had unbridled access to historical documents and manuscripts in the Bolton Library. And in the Bolton Library, he actually set up a small museum, and he catalogued all of the objects that he had in the museum in 1880. And that collection included things like stained glass from the rock, oak fragments from the roof of the cathedral on the rock of Cashel. There were coins, tradesmen's tokens, medals, and he also had his own collection of about 1,500 local street ballads that he had collected since 1884, just on Cashel. So what a resource that must have been, and where is it now? But also then importantly, he published a weekly newspaper, the Cashel Gazette, which came out on a Saturday from about 1864. And in that Cashel Gazette, he included extracts and bits and pieces that he had found from the manuscripts and the documents in the Bolton Library, including extracts from the grants of settlement and explanation from 1666 to 1684. Now, I'd known about these extracts for a long number of years, and I'd been looking at them for a long number of years going, oh my God, this information for Cashel is phenomenal. So I've used the detail from those extracts for a lot of my work over the last couple of years. But also on top of those extracts from the grants of settlement and explanation, he also included extracts from deeds and wills that were held in the Bolton Library, minutes of the Corporation of Cashel that survived from 1672. They're absolutely fascinating. And there's also extracts from the depositions relating to Cashel. And of those, there are depositions, there's detail there, like when you actually filter down through what's been written and what's been claimed, the detail for Cashel is fantastic. And I loved in particular the depositions relating to Anna Hamilton, who was the wife of the Archbishop, and they made massive claims. That's a whole lecture in itself, I think, but we'll keep going on it. So on top of that as well, then John Davis White recorded extracts from the minutes of the chapter books, and they are in the Bolton Library as well. And then also for my work on this project, I also looked at Laffan's Hearth Money records and the Civil Survey from 1654. And now, critically, that doesn't survive for the town, unlike Kilkenny, unfortunately. But we do have civil survey details for the suburbs around the town of Cashel as well. So I started to just knit all of that information together. I created a GIS project where I started to plot the detail and map what I had found. And so I now have a very rudimentary map of the 17th century town with all of the information relating to all of those deeds. All of that information are plotted in GIS now, which is absolutely brilliant. Well, I'm saying that absolutely not trying to big myself up there now, but it's a really, really useful resource, and it's there and it's mapped, and I can go back to it time and time again. So it's fantastic to have it all in one place. That's what I meant by that. So the Acts of Settlement then themselves of 1662, for people that mightn't be familiar with them, they embody the post-Cromwellian, the government's land policy. Okay, and its full title is An Act for the Better Execution of His Majesty's Gracious Declaration for the Settlement of His Kingdom of Ireland and Satisfaction of the Several Interests of Adventurers, Soldiers and his other subjects there. Okay, so in other words, it's talking about how the land was distributed post-Cromwell. Okay, but that act and that measure was found to be unworkable because there wasn't actually sufficient land to satisfy all of the claims that were made on the land that was there. So in consequence, that act was amended 3 years later by the Act of Explanation in 1665. And by the provisions of that later Act of Explanation, the various Protestant interests lost about 1/3 of their claims to the land, while all of the unheard Catholic petitioners were debarred from bringing their cases before the Court of Claims. So very important information for us. What does it look like? Now, I don't want you to get freaked out by the amount of text you're going to see. We're not going to go through it in detail, but I just wanted to show you this to give you an idea of how the extract text is presented in the John Davis White information and in Cashel of the Kings. So this is raw information here, and I've been looking at this for years going, oh my God, look at it. It's got so many houses, it's got so many gardens, it's got so many plots, it's got streets, it's got lanes, it's got you name it. So I started to disentangle it. And when I looked at it in a little bit of detail, I can see that of particular note is at the start of each of the entries, you'll see the grantees. So these two guys here, Captain Gilbert Rawson and Captain Henry Broom, they were effectively granted all of this in Castletown. In fact, they were granted most of Castletown. When I say granted, they were granted the rental value, the rents that came with each of these properties and each of these plots. Okay. After that, what we have is a plot and buildings description. So we've part of a large stone house, a garden and a yard, and the rental value on that is 5 shillings and 11 pence. And then also we have all of those other things, but the most important thing is the way that all of this information is grouped, because the location is given at the end of the description. So all of these features here, in the first 3 lines, are all in Friar Street. And then we have all of the next entries are over the gate in Conify or in Friar's Quarter. So you can see that you could start to break them down and see where all of these bits and pieces were actually located in the town. And I've always asked myself the question, is it possible to actually plot them consecutively? The simple answer to that is no, unfortunately not. And in that regard, it's very much the same as what had happened when people tried to plot the properties that are documented in the civil survey in Kilkenny as well. The information is just too scatty. It's just not consistent. Just to give you an idea of more of the information, so here we have John Lord Viscount Mazarine, who was granted all of this in Cashel, as well, the rentals on all of that in Cashel. And just to note as well, when it comes to this gentleman, the Foster Mazarine papers actually survive in the Public Records Office in Northern Ireland, and it's an absolutely vast collection of estate and family documents there that date to from the 16th century to the 20th century. So I think when I retire, I might actually live in Prony in Northern Ireland as well, because there's bound to be so much more information there relating to Cashel that, you know, we just need to actually trawl through all of this information and pull out the detail for the town. And then, of course, the church were grantees as well. So I've just pulled out two of the extracts here, the first belonging to the Archbishop of Cashel. And this is a really important one because it describes the palace that's there in 1666. And of course, the palace that's there in 1666 is Myler McGrath's palace. It's not the palace building that we know today. So we have a description of it. The stone house, and next to it another stone building, formerly of the same stone house, with a range of buildings backwards adjoining, a large backside wherein there are 3 cabins and a dove house and a large garden. And the rental value on that is £2, 14 shillings and 6 pence. So you can see there's a lot of detail there that we might necessarily have seen or known about Myler McGrath's palace before that. But I think of all of the extracts that we have from the Grants of Settlement and Explanation, my favourite one is this one, relating to Essex Digby, Minister of the City of Cashel. And the reason why I love this one so much is because, first and foremost, it has a location at the corner of Hackett's Lane, okay? And the second reason is because it gives us the dimensions. So if every extract was like that, yes, it would be possible to actually plot a lot more of the buildings and the plots for Cashel in the 17th century. So when it came to actually setting about mapping the information then, just to give you an idea of some of the issues that I came up against. And I suppose the first question really was, with those extracts, is it actually a full survey of the town of Cashel? So does it include all of the buildings that were in Cashel in 1666? And I think the answer is probably no, because what we're dealing with is properties with rental values. So there's potentially other buildings that, fall outside of that category. There's also very few mentions of lanes in Cashel, and we know that there were lanes in Cashel in the 17th century. They're not described on it. So there must have been other buildings that fronted onto laneways that just don't occur in the extracts themselves. And it probably only deals with the rental properties, as I've said. The other issue I have is that the locational directions are very, very scant. So unlike the Hackett's Lane example, there's very few that has that level of detail. And any locational markers that are mentioned in the grants, they're generally not present anymore, so it's hard to pinpoint exactly where they might have been. The terminology as well is problematic because I don't know what a backside actually is, so it's obviously at the side or the back of a building, but what does it actually mean? There's a court lidge, there's all kinds of different terminology used, so it's not consistent across the extracts as well. We can't be sure that the buildings that are mentioned are fronting onto the street. So in other words, if we're trying to draw a street line, we can't say that they were in a nice neat row along the front of the street. Some of them might have been set back. There might have been open space to the front. So unless it's actually specified, we can't say that. Also, there's no reference to shops, and there's very few references to industry. I think the thing that's mentioned most in the grants is actually horse mills. So I think there's 4 or 5 horse mills within the town of Cashel in the mid-17th century. It is nearly impossible to reconcile the rental values with the descriptions of assets. So say, for example, we have 2 entries with the same rental value. One of those entries might have a very large stone house and the other might only have a cabin on it. So it's actually probably more of a reference to the plot, and everything in the plot is the rental value rather than the buildings themselves. So that is problematic when you're trying to tease through the information. There's a lack of measurements, as we said, and then a big issue was actually trying to map it on base maps, because obviously plot boundaries will have changed in the interim, so the morphology of the town will have changed. So it was difficult to know which base map to actually use, and I'll show you what I've used now in a second. And then another issue is just that we don't have a civil survey for the town of Cashel, for the urban town of Cashel itself. We do, as I said, for parts of the suburbs, but not for the town itself. But what are the opportunities? And that's the bit I'm really interested in. What can we do with the information? So it's cross-referencing. That's the biggest opportunity that we have. So it's cross-referencing what we know now from the grants of settlement and explanation, those descriptions of buildings, of properties, of plots, and cross-referencing it with things like the hearth money records, where we know how many hearths there were in a house. And then we have the names to go along with those properties as well. So seeing, can we tie together that information is really important. This is the key takeaway for me as well. It's what I've done in mapping is to plot the presence of those assets. Sometimes I'll have a good indication of where things are, but generally when you look at my maps, it's the presence of a house or a garden or an orchard or a barn or whatever it is, and that's what I've done with this project. Previously unrecorded features have turned up, numerous ones, so again that's really important, but it's very important for things like cross-referencing with archaeological excavations. So when we go into an area now, we know on Main Street there might have been 2 very large houses. So when we go and do test excavations or full excavations, we'll know we're looking for 2 very large houses that date to the 17th century, or we know we're looking for a smithy, or we know we're looking for a horse mill. Do you know what I mean? So that's really invaluable for archaeologists working forward. Yeah, so it shows the potential for the survival or the presence of previously unrecorded 17th century or earlier buildings within the town. And from all of that work, then we can start to build a database which can be further used then to work out, can we see social differentiation within the town? Can we see areas where, you know, the wealthier people were living? What were the poor people living in? You know, so there's all of that potential is there with the data that we've got. Okay, so that's just a quick run through the issues. This is my base map that I've used consistently throughout now, because I found it probably the easiest one to use to plot the information. It's the first edition's 25-inch map from 1901. So it's not the first edition from the 19th century. It's the later one. And what we have here overlaid on it. So in OpenStreetMap and using QGIS, I digitized the outline of the medieval town walls, and I just dropped it in on top of the 25-inch map. So within the medieval town wall, which is that blue line around the outside, you can see I've noted the key features, the 5 gates, and then the other 2 key features within the town that I've noted are the palace and Carney's Castle as well. So that's the tower house in the middle of Cashel town itself. Okay, so Main Street there, just running from southwest to northeast through the middle of the map. Okay. Now, here we go. So when I took all of that information from the grants of settlement and explanation and put it all into Excel files and GIS, what I ended up with was 21 categories of stone or potential stone houses or residential buildings, not including the cabins or the ruins, okay? And I know it looks unwieldy, but I just wanted to be kind of consistent with it. So there, you know, it's literally taking the information word for word and going, okay, we have large stone houses that are thatched, we have large stone houses that are slated, we have large stone houses where we don't know what kind of a roof it was, and then we have large houses where we don't know what the walls were made of. So it was just literally trying to be systematic in the categorization of the information. In terms of trying to actually work out what my original aim was, and that's where are the big Renaissance era buildings in Cashel. The ones that I'm going to concentrate are the ones that are in red here. So they're the larger buildings that have a rental value of over, the larger plots and buildings that have a rental value of over £1. Okay, so that's the main focus of it. When you break that down, what we have is a potential stock of 65 inhabitable stone buildings in Cashel. Of those, we have 34 that are definitely stone and 31 that are potentially stone. 14 are stone built and slated, and 12 are more specifically referenced as being large stone buildings. Okay, so that's just a breakdown of inhabitable stone buildings in the town. And in terms of the rental values and the locations of those, right, so again, remember these are our houses that are valued at over £1. So you can see there's my 21 categories of buildings. And you can see the big one, the big red star is the castle, or the bigger houses. Look at that one, it's 5 shillings, 11 pence. There's the palace at £2. That's Carney's Castle again. So large slated houses, you can see that there's definitely 2 of them on John Street, and there are 2 just up here as well on Canopy Street. This whole area here in the grants of settlement and explanation is called Canopy Quarter. So in terms of the distribution of the properties and the plots in the town was split up into quarters. So Canopy Quarter is the one that is most referenced in those grants. But if you look at the distribution of where you have the buildings, and again, this is presence or absence, you can see that it is on the south western side of Main Street that we have a really, really dense distribution of those buildings, and up in Canopy Quarter as well. So there's less of them actually referenced for Friar Street and that area there. You'd think, again, just to reiterate, in terms of valuation, it should be straightforward, but you know, there's one stretch here along this area, a 600 feet long stretch of what's described as waste plots, gardens and old stone walls in Friar Street. Right, so this whole section along here is described as being waste. So there's no inhabitable houses on it, but it does have one of the highest rental values of all of the plots and the areas that are described in the grants of settlement and explanation. So what then about the lower class housing, the cabins? And again, I've got 4 categories of cabins recorded in the data, excluding the ruins and anything that's in new use. So I have a total of 80 cabins that are inhabitable, that are described in the grants of settlement and explanation. But we really can't be sure that they're all stone built. However, I think given the frequency of stone-built cabins surviving in the town and the ready availability of stone as a building material from local quarries, I think it's fair to suggest that there's a strong potential for all of those cabins to be of stone. The other thing to note is that with the larger houses as well, there's not one building described as having brick in it in 1666, and there's not one building described as being half timbered or being a timber house or dwelling. Okay, so this is a stone town in 1666, and that matches other descriptions that we have from different records that describe in 1654 there was a great fire in the town which destroyed all of the buildings except the stone-built ones that were inhabited by the English because God favoured the English residents of the town. But as far as I can work out, this is almost exclusively a stone-built town in the 17th century. And it's unusual because we know that the new palace has brick. So the old palace, that's the question we need to actually address, is was there brick in Myler McGrath's Renaissance era palace, which is entirely possible when you think of Ormond Castle, which has some of the earliest brick in the country. So Myler and Black Tom would have been very much aware of each other and would have been, building very fancy buildings at that stage in the latest fashion. So I think it's entirely possible that in the 17th century the old Cashel Palace would have had some brick in it, but it's not described in the records. So where were the cabins then? And what have we got? We have a total housing stock in the grants of settlement and explanation of 145 pretty much residential buildings. That's the 65, we'll call them houses, and 80 cabins. And of those, it's very interesting, 34 of our 80 cabins are outside of the town walls. Okay? So we've 19 cabins in Lower Gate, 4 at Johns Gate, 2 at Upper Friar Street, and 9 beyond Canopy Gate as well, which is pretty interesting. What about the open space in the town in the 17th century then? And again, this is really interesting as well. So again, just these are my categories. I have 4 categories: gardens, orchards, void or waste plots of ground, and then fields. So you can see there's a huge amount of gardens described. There's 2 gardens of fruit trees, 4 orchards, so in total 6 orchards, and 22 void or waste plots of ground. So you can see these ones, 2 void plots where a house stood. So clearly they must have been medieval buildings that were now, gone out of use. They were ruined, and they're described as void in 1666. This one is interesting. The park here, which is it's described as an area 1.5 acres, and it's described as being outside the town wall on this side. When you look at the modern mapping, everyone, I think, will know this field. It's the one that's slightly elevated, just coming down from the rock at the edge of the circular road. It's 1.5 acres, and I think that there's a strong likelihood that this hasn't changed since the 17th century. That field is still there. And there's also 1 grass plot enclosed on Main Street, so a little bit of a field in Main Street. So again, looking at the distribution, you can see that the gardens and the open space are very much concentrated around where we had our houses from the earlier plots as well. So about looking at the gardens and the open space, there's about 52% of all of the houses, including the cabins, that had gardens. And if you look more closely at the data then, there is 1 garden plot in Lower Gate which actually contains 5 cabins. And on the other side of the lane, there's another garden that has 6 cabins in it. So north of Canopy Gate then as well, there's 7 cabins. Each of them has their own individual garden plot. And the same pattern is seen then beyond St. John's Gate. So I need to do much more work here on teasing out the information to provide a more accurate statistical picture of the distribution of gardens to buildings. But what I think I can say is that the presence of a garden associated with your house or your plot in the 17th century doesn't indicate any kind of social status at all, because the cabins had the gardens as well as, you know, the bigger areas. So in terms of what the gardens contained, we have a pretty good description for the Archbishop's garden. At the palace, he had 2 gardens of fruit trees, and at Lower Gate there was another orchard. But there is one absolute killer reference for Canopy Street. Okay, so what we've done here is look at cross-referencing the records from the 17th century for Peyton LeHunt. Right now, he's the mayor of Cashel in 1665 and again in 1666. So the value of his house, he has a house that has 3 hearths valued at 6 shillings. So that's in the hearth money records, okay? And then when you look at the grants from 1666, and I went looking for Peyton LeHunt in those grants, there's a description of a new low-built house with a thatched house behind it, a garden behind that which extends to the town walls, and a pair of old walls. And the value of that is 3 shillings, and it's described as being on Canopy Street as well. So then, when you look at the corporation records for 1675, go looking for Peyton LeHunt, and you can see it's ordered that Peyton LeHunt, Esquire, the mayor, shall have a lease from this corporation of his new dwelling house and a rose garden for 31 years at 10 shillings per annum. Okay, so the question then is, if there's a low new built house here in 1666, could that be Peyton LeHunt? Would a house still be considered new 9 years later? And that's the big question for me. But look at this, he gets his grant on the 5th of August 1675, but on the 24th of August he's dead, he dies. But then his sons, I'm presuming these are his sons, Charles and George, become sworn freemen later on in the records. So it's possible that this all refers to the property of Peyton LeHunt. And the interesting thing for me is then, if this is the case, it clearly shows that one of the premier residents of the town, the mayor, is living in a house with 3 hearths that's not classed as being a large house. Okay, so who exactly is living in the large houses? And if we look in a little bit more detail, in the hearth money records, there is an entry for a man called Richard LeHunt, which I'm not actually sure, and I need to look this up, I need to do a bit more work on it, is to see, is Richard LeHunt Peyton LeHunt's son? But Richard LeHunt is living in a house on Canopy Street that has 8 hearths, valued at 16 shillings. It's, again, one of the reasons why I say it's not a full, the grants of settlement and explanation is not a full record of the 17th century housing stock, because that house with the value, with all of those hearths, the 8 hearths, is not referenced in the grants of settlement and explanation detail. But I've kind of plotted these here pretty much together, because I think that in all likelihood Richard and Peyton LeHunt are going to be related, and it's probably a father and a son or something similar living beside each other in Canopy Street in the 17th century, with a really nice big house and then a smaller house that has a rose garden behind it as well. So all of that detail is starting to emerge for Canopy Street, which is really nice to know, because again, if there's excavations that go on in Canopy Street, we know now to look for a house that had 8 hearths. We know to look for a house that had another thatched house behind it and that had a rose garden. There could be garden archaeology to be done there as well. So while we're still in Canopy Street, just again tying together some of the information that we have for it, from the grants of settlement and explanation from 1666, I've always loved this description. We've got a parcel of old walls and waste walls with a roof joining to the east gate and a stone house slated over the gate in Canopy Quarter. Okay, so this is from one of the English towns. I forget the name now. I'll remember in a minute. But I think it gives us a good indication of what might actually have existed over Canopy Gate in Cashel. This is the north gate in Feathered. So you can see it's not too much of a stretch of an imagination to think that this is actually, well as what the North Gate in Feathered might have looked like, but what Canopy Gate would have looked like as well. But this whole detail then, the rest of this is very interesting, because the corporation records from 1676 tell us that outside Canopy Gate, so on the outside of the town, we have walls that were formerly raised for a fortification in the wartime, as well as the medieval fortifications outside it, and presumably following the 1641 activities in Cashel, there were extra fortifications built outside the medieval town walls. And in 1676, they're asking that they be demolished with all convenience speed, because they're useless and a nuisance to the city. And they're impeding coaches and wagons and carriages from actually coming into the town. And they're saying that the ground that the fortifications stood on has to be paved, okay? A couple of years later, 4 years later, ordered that the house fallen down over Canopy Gate to forthwith clear the stones and rubbish fallen down from the town wall and build up the wall again. 1680, later in the year, having ordered that it be cleared away, they're now saying that they have to be brought back again. The stones have to be brought back again, or their costs being replaced, because the stones actually belong to the corporation. So a bit of hindsight in play there within the same year. But look at this then as well. The corporation records from 1692 and 93, the Canopy Gate, the present passage in the fortifications about that gate. Here we're looking back to this fortification, the wartime fortification here, and that a new large passage be made for coaches and a cart, and with stone and good mortar, and secure each side of ye new passage. So in other words, the fortifications were still there. They hadn't been cleared away, the road hadn't been paved, but it's invaluable, because now we know if we're ever doing excavations on the old Ladieswell Road or Dublin Canopy Gate side, that we're to be looking for these fortifications, which, you know, I'm not sure that that's ever been really clear before now, but obviously we know it now, and we know what to look out for. And then just the last bit of information that it's only a snippet relating to Canopy Gate. 20 shillings a year be given to Charles Minchin, not to build over Canopy Gate, but to leave it an open passage the full breadth of the street from Weldon's house on one side to Charles Wogan's concern on the other. So there we have the names of the people that lived in the buildings at either side of Canopy Gate in the 17th century. So, you know, invaluable information. Just keep an eye on that Wogan, because he crops up again shortly. Now, just inside Canopy Gate then, so just as you come down towards Morelli's, for anyone that Morelli's on the left-hand side, if you know it, in the 17th century, I think the gatehouse of Canopy Gate was still standing. So in 2009, myself and Jean Farrelly went in to survey just there in the back of what was Marjorie Noonan's house. Marjorie invited us in, and we got such a delightful surprise, because standing that wall is actually one of the internal walls of an early modern building. So when I say early modern, it's probably late 16th century in date, late 15th or 16th century in date, and it's still extant there. There's windows, there's doors, there's you name it, still surviving in that wall. So the interesting thing for me is, at the junction between these two buildings, there's quite a wide barge board here. So I think that this wall, if you went in and took off if you did some opening up works inside in this building, you'd find that this is going to be an early modern wall as well. So that's just, there's little indications of survival of late medieval or early modern material within the town itself as well. This building here is not medieval and is not 17th century in date, but it does tie in the earlier material that's there. I love this one very much because I was so involved in it, and I know lots of people have heard me talking about this before, but on Canopy Street, in the Grants of Settlement and Explanation, there's just this little reference here, old walls to the street wherein is a smith's shop, and the rental value was 11 shillings and 5 or 6 pence there. And in 2005, I did the excavations on this site, and lo and behold, what did we find? Only the remains of a smithy. So this is a beautiful example of where the historical documents and the archaeology actually match and tie together, and it's just lovely when that actually happens. It's not all slog on the side. You can see Jim there having a nice balance in the Rock of Cashel on his head. Yeah. Now, so moving on then to John Street. This is another really interesting area when you start to tease apart the information. So the chapter book of 1664, again recorded in John Davis White's extracts there in Cashel of the Kings, we can see a lease is made to Morgan Wogan. Remember in Canopy Street we had a Wogan who owned the property beside the gate, and he had been granted the waste walls when there had been formerly a bakehouse, commonly called the name of the great bakehouse, alias Bakehouse Moor, in which it was covenanted that he should build one stone house, slated or shingled, together with a good oven on the premises. Okay, so that was an earlier reference, okay, in 1664. But in 1672, the same man, so Morgan Wogan, had a renewal for and in consideration of the English-like good and fair improvements that he had made. So in other words, he had made a building, but it was situated on the west side of John Street, and there are 3 houses now upon the place where it stood. So this is telling us that the bakehouse was demolished, and in its place we have 3 new houses that are built. But it's on the west side of John Street, okay? And in the grants of settlement and explanation then in 1666, we have the reference to Wogan's bakehouse. So it's a thatched house used as a common bakehouse. So again, you see where the cross-referencing of the details and the information can give us plenty of information. We know that it was a low-built house, a garden, a thatched house, and old walls wherein a horse mill was kept. So when you try and, again, plotting the presence or the absence of it, you go to the west side of John Street, and I looked for a property that would have been big enough to have a house, or the bakehouse to the front, a garden, a thatched house, and old walls. And I think that there's a potential that this plot here could have been the area where the bakehouse was actually located. I think it's not a bad fit for me. It works quite well. Again, if we think back to my favourite extract, Essex Digby, the one where we had the location and the measurements. He was the minister of the city of Cashel. In John Street, he had a house to the street, high-built stone walls and slated at the corner of Hackett's Lane, containing 45. So there's the measurements to him. So at the corner of Hackett's Lane, this is Hackett's Lane here. So if this is the bakehouse, this must have been the location for Essex Digby's house. And the interesting thing for me is that he was the minister, and we know that this was the house of the clergy. So it was the house where the religious lived in Cashel. And actually John Davis White bought this house from the church as well. So it seems pretty likely to me that this is the plot, this is the house where Essex Digby lived in 1666, which is brilliant. So I can tie, I think, quite confidently can tie Essex Digby from the 17th century to that plot there. It doesn't happen very often, so when it does, it's a joy. Now, this is where things get a little bit scary, and I'm going to just refer to my notes here because I have 3 references here from the 17th century to tie together. So in the grants of settlement and explanation from 1666, we have a description on John Street for part of a garden that joins to the church and churchyard. So here's the church and churchyard, and the part of a garden that joins to it must have been where Acres Lane now is. Okay, so that's a good reference to what was here in 1666. The second one is probably the most exciting discovery that I've made in the whole process of doing this work, because I think I have located a new and previously unrecorded castle in Cashel. Okay, so if you look at the reference from 1666, this is on John Street. We have a cabin to the street, a garden to the same, and a yard backwards, and a castle to the street, a small garden and a backside in John Street. Okay, now the question for me then was, in looking at this, I was going, oh my God, this is quite exciting. But could that be a reference to Carney's Castle? Could it be a reference to the building that's on Main Street? So I needed to just figure it out to see, try and make it clear in my mind that we're actually looking at something different here. And I think we are, because in the grants of settlement and explanation and in all of the other 17th century records that I've looked at, the castle on the Tower House on Main Street is a municipal building in the 17th century. So we know a few bits and pieces about it. We know that all of the buckets for the well, the buckets and the chains for the well, which is where the pipes were actually located in Carney's Castle. So people had to go there and actually access the buckets for the well from that location. It's also the place that the Night's Watch operated out of in 1666, in the 17th century as well. And it very clearly is, I think, a municipal building in the 17th century. Okay. This is very clearly referred to and none of the other municipal buildings in the town are referred to in the grants of settlements and explanation as well. So we have a reference to a castle on John Street, and in terms of looking for a location that might fit a castle or a tower house on John Street, I looked very closely at this building line here, and this plot stood out to me because of the fact it's significantly bigger than most of its neighbours, but also it has laneways on both sides of it. So it looked to me like it could have been a freestanding tower house or castle that had laneways and access on both sides. I'm not saying that that's where it was, but I'm saying that that is a good potential location for a castle on John Street. Now, the last one is, again, another really, really interesting one. We know where we are at the top of John Street here on the green, and we have this row of wonderful vernacular buildings. That's the Church of Ireland graveyard, the Anglican graveyard at the back here, and the line of the town wall runs along at the base of the trees there as well. So the corporation records from 1692, we have a lease granted to a Reverend Mr. John LeHunt. So again, LeHunt is a common name in the town in the 17th century. But he gets the gardens on the Great Green and the stone house in the middle of the High Street, formerly took out by the other Reverend. But he's given leave to erect a double ditch in a straight line on the outmost bounds of that new garden upon the Great Green, from each corner of the town walls that's built upon the churchyard of St. John's. So the town walls that are built on the churchyard of St. John's start here and run all the way back to where the row of trees end there, okay? Including therein the outmost angle of the fort built in the middle thereof, okay? So that is telling us that there was a fortification, another fortification in here in the 17th century. So just like we had additional fortifications built outside Canopy Gate for protection and defence, we had fortifications built here. And in 1692, permission is given to build a to dig a double ditch around those, okay? So what kind of magic information is that for archaeologists? And actually, I know that in the early 2000s, there was an excavation done out just behind these houses here. The excavator did find a double ditch, but at the time it wasn't clear what the dating for that ditch was, and it's described in the records as being a potential ecclesiastical ditch because it follows the line of these buildings here. So it looked like it was curving around like you'd find in an ecclesiastical ditch. But I actually think what they found now is that double ditch that dates to 1692. Make perfect sense. You can't talk about Cashel in the 17th century without a quick reference to the palace. Again, it's not the building that we're looking at here that's present in the 17th century. It's Myler McGrath's palace. And in 2016, I was fortunate enough to do all of the pre-planning archaeological testing in the palace grounds. And in the front, just here, in front of the front door, I dug one little test trench. So there's the palace building there. So around about here, I dug this test trench. In it, we had lots of different layers of cobbles, which are all relatable to 18th century resurfacing of the yard for the front of the Cashel Palace. But as I dug down through this little sondage, this little little slot trench, I came across entirely different cobbles at the base of my excavation. It's not the bottom of archaeology. The archaeology goes way down, but you can see these cobbles here. And I actually always thought that these relate to Myler McGrath's palace, that these are the floors of Myler McGrath's palace. And we know that that palace was demolished before 1728 in order to make way for the building that we have here today. Now, in the subsequent excavations in the redevelopment of the palace, I know that the archaeologist involved did find a substantial building right fronting onto the street. Okay, so there's great evidence for a building, a really substantial building on the street front. But it looks, and I'm not saying that it is, but it looks like it could be a medieval building. And I think that that medieval building might also have been demolished in order to make way for Myler's Palace. So giving a good view down to Myler's Palace, which was set back off the road. So we now have, I think, we have the medieval street front, and we have what was demolished then to make way for Myler's Palace, and then we have here what was demolished to make way for the present palace on that site as well. So a really good picture of the chronology and the urban sort of morphology in this part of Cashel itself. But in terms of Myler's Palace and in terms of the scale of the building, in 1665 or 66, we know that that building has 11 hearts, and the rental or the heart money value on it was 22 shillings. So it is, and the rental value from the grants of settlement and explanation was over £2. It's definitely the most prestigious building in Cashel, without a shadow of a doubt. Okay. Just very quickly then moving on towards the end, up around Upper Friar Street. So here we have the Catholic Church on Friar Street, obviously occupying the site of the former Franciscan friary, the medieval friary. So the town gate came across roughly here. The friary would originally have been outside of the town walls. But in the grants of settlement and explanation in 1666, there's a description for a range of old walls to the street where houses stood, beginning at Walter Fleming's house and ending at the great church house of John Halley, with some backsides and gardens, okay? So we've a reference to a man called John Halley, and he owns the great church house on Friar Street, or around Friar Street. So when you try and cross-reference that then with the 1654 civil surveys, it's one of the instances where the detail does survive. So you can see John Halley of Cashel, civilian and Irish papist, and his lands, so not just a plot in the town, but his lands are bounded on the south with the Archbishop lands, on the west with the Corporation of Cashel lands, on the north with George's land in this parish, and on the east with the Archbishop's lands previously mentioned. So those lands are out somewhere out here, and we can see that on those lands they have on them a big thatched house and 5 or 6 cabins. So the big question for me is that big thatched house the great church house of John Halley? And I don't know that I'll ever get a satisfactory answer to that. Now, me 2 Dutch billies in Cashel. For anyone that doesn't know what a Dutch billy is, can you see this boy here with the lovely curvilinear pedimented gable and its neighbour here to the east? They're 2 Dutch billies. So what's a Dutch billy, you might ask? They're a style of narrow, usually brick, terraced house. They have a distinctive gable end, and they're very common in Dublin and other Irish cities from the late 17th century. And they're named, or they're thought to be named, Dutch billies after William of Orange. And they're influenced by the architecture of the Netherlands and from the influx of the Huguenots and Dutch Protestant refugees after 1685. They're often built with a single chimney stack, and the chimney stack is often shared by 2 houses. And they feature gables that have sweeping curves or triangular pediments to them. The style fell out of favour in the mid to late 18th century, and they were often replaced. So the facades were often replaced or refronted with Georgian style facades, so classical facades. And I think that's exactly what has happened to this building here, which is this one. here. So this image here is by Robert French, and it's about 1865 or thereabouts. And this image here is from the Ballinamona collection, the Murphy archives. And you can see much more clearly here the gable front. And just look at the way the roof is running back that way. Look at the angle of the chimneys here compared to the rest of them. It's totally at odds with everything else on the street. But you can see that this one is 1865, this one is 1914, a fair day in Cashel. And they're all on the Tipperary archives and online. These photographs, these you can see from the National Library collection as well. That's part of the Lawrence collection there, that one. But look at the changes between 1865 and 1914. I know it's the Dutch billies I'm concerned with here, but I'm also really interested in this building here. So this is Davern's, and this is now Davern's as well. And you can see between 1865 and 1914 that this building has been rebuilt. Because look, it's a completely different roof. That's a new detail on it. The windows now match the rest of the windows in Davern's. So it's been demolished and rebuilt. So that's really key now for the National Inventory of Architectural Heritage. We can now pretty accurately date that part of Davern's building on Main Street. Yeah, so this one here was demolished probably in the late 50s. I know I was talking to Sean O'Dear. He told me that it had been a ruin. But we know that it's a building that was always associated with the Hanley family in Cashel. And this was Hanley's Corner. There was a shop at the lower level. I think Nanny Hanley is the name of one of the residents in it. And that was demolished sometime in the late 1950s. But this one just stands as a sole surviving, and I would give my eye teeth to get inside and see where are the chimneys, what's the arrangement, are there corner chimney places in it. It's just such an important building for Cashel. And it's not the only important building for Cashel as well. And these are ones where, you know, there is a lot more work that is needed on it. And I'm just going to fly very quickly through some of these. So this was, do you remember where Canopy Gate was? This is Marjorie Noonan's house. I'll always refer to it as Marjorie Noonan's house, where myself and Jean Farrelly found the late medieval or early modern wall in the back. But it makes total sense jutting out onto the street when you see the neighbour that was there beside it. And that's because this is Morgan Wogan's house on one side and the other guy's house on the other, at either side of Canopy Gate. So Canopy Gate just sat in the space between those two buildings. But look at this building. Again, because of the arrangement of it, I know it's gable fronting out onto the street, but there is potential for that to have been a 17th century building as well. So really important. That photograph was taken at the Eucharistic Congress, Cashel celebrations of it in the 1930s. The cross in Cashel. In those grants of settlement and explanation, the location of the cross is plotted accurately. It's not here, it's further over. It's further over to the back of, you know, the building there that has the big billboard on it. So the middle row in Canopy Street, it's just further over. So when you came down Canopy Street here, the cross was located straight in front of you. That was the market cross in Cashel. And that is the only reference to a market cross that I know from the 17th century. And it's potentially giving us a very good indication that there was a medieval market cross there earlier on in Cashel's history as well. So really important. So that cross, or the replica of this cross, is now on the plaza, as we know. I've pulled out this picture here, which is looking down Friar Street. So Main Street is off down in this direction. So looking from where that cross would have been, looking down Friar Street. And I've pulled out this photo because look at this one. Again, another potential Dutch billy just there. So now the stock of potential Dutch billies for Cashel is risen to 3 or 4. Whereas before now we've only had one, that building that survives on Main Street. So it just goes to show how important these photographs actually are. Feehans in Cashel, and again this was 1930s. The relationship between this building and the Shambles buildings at the town hall is really important. But in the 17th century records, Feehan's building is described with that 17th century plaque in place on the building. So that is, the 17th century plaque is commemorating the establishment of the Dominican College in Cashel. Okay, it's Laffan's plaque. So if that plaque is described as being in place in the 17th century, it's giving us an indication that Feehan's building predates that plaque. Okay, so I don't know, it's not a medieval building, but it's definitely an earlier building, for an early modern building for Cashel, and a lot more work needs to be done on that building there. I've pulled out this photo here, which is at Lower Gate Street, down where the fountain is still in place at the triangle about at the bottom of Cashel. But look at this building here. Now, this is a Georgian building, right? There's no two ways about it. So it's later than the period I'm interested in. But I am interested in this building because of this part here. So can you see this? It's like a little outshot to the front of the building. And the front entrance to the shop is outshot as well. That is not in keeping with kind of good Georgian design for a building of this scale. I showed this photo to our built heritage specialist, Ciara Uff, in the company I'm working for, and she's absolutely fascinated by it because she thinks that in all likelihood that is part of earlier medieval masonry, which has just been conveniently incorporated into the later Georgian building as well. So again, evidence for more bits and pieces surviving around the town. Same with this building here. It is Georgian and classical in appearance, but the fact that you have extra doors in it that disrupts the classical proportions and layout and arrangement of opes and windows and all of that is very interesting as well. But look at the buildings all along here. They're all thatched. And that is, this one is late 1880s, if I remember correctly. This is the old garrison buildings, the barracks in Cashel, down where the Garda station is. Again, it is Georgian, but it's again a building that, or a whole area of Cashel that a lot more work needs to be done on. And finally, my latest obsession in Cashel is 100% this building here, which is next door to the City Bar, if you know it, in Cashel. But look at the pitch on that roof. Look at the chimney on that. Look at the offset windows. The proportions are not Georgian. They're much earlier than that. And I think that this one, more than any other building, probably has the potential to be a medieval building still standing on Main Street in Cashel. And it just goes to show that there is much more work to be done on the town. So I'm going to wrap it up there now, just with a few conclusions. What have we learned from all of this exercise? Firstly, it is not possible to accurately map the people or places or the buildings that are referenced in the 17th century documents, but it is possible to compile the database, which allows for cross-referencing of the data in the future. I need to do much more cartographic analysis, especially in relation to the first edition map, and also more stats like the wells, the industry, shops, economy, agriculture. All of that needs to be examined for Cashel. 100% we need to synthesize all of the excavations data that we have for Cashel. So all of the excavations that have taken place over the years, get the information, map it, and plot it against, cross-reference it against the information that's in the 17th century records. Further research on the primary sources. If I could get my hands on anything in particular, that's who I want to look at, Archbishop Bolton's papers, because he was an engineer. He built a 2-mile network of drains around the town of Cashel in the 18th century. But because he was an engineer, he was meticulous, so I'm presuming there would be good drawings, there would be good detail included in his papers. So I'm dying to see if his papers survive, or could we get at them. And then obviously we need to know how many more buildings are survivable. But I think overall, first and foremost for me, what's very clear from the work is that we definitely need a research framework for Cashel. It's crying out for it. And I'm going to wrap it up there and say thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry for keeping you for so long. I hope you enjoyed it.